The night Kentucky chose its senator, 5 souls departed this world by a woman's steady hand. November 8, 1842, election night in Lexington, when the bourbon flowed like gospel truth and the laughter of powerful men echoed through Senator Whitmore's mansion like thunder before the storm. But in the kitchen quarters, where shadows danced with secrets older than the Republic itself, Lydia ground her herbs with the patience of someone who had waited 37 years for justice. She was no ordinary house servant. The Cherokee grandmother who raised her in the hills before the white men came had whispered the old ways into her young ears, which roots could heal, which berries could harm, and how the earth itself held memories of blood and bone. Tonight, those whispered lessons would speak louder than any ballad ever cast. The senator and his 4 kinsmen, his brother Judge Whitmore, his sons Thomas and Benjamin, and his brother-in-law Colonel Hayes, had gathered to celebrate what they believed was their divine right to rule over the bodies and souls of others. They had no notion that their final supper was being prepared by hands that remembered every lash, every scream, every child sold away in the darkness of dawn. Before we continue with this tale of reckoning, drop a comment telling us where you're from and what time it is over there. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because some stories demand to be heard. The Whitmore mansion stood like a monument to stolen labor, its white columns gleaming under the November moon, while shadows crawled between its walls like guilty thoughts. Inside the grand dining room, crystal chandeliers cast rainbows across mahogany tables laden with silver platters, roasted duck glazed with honey, sweet potatoes candied with molasses, cornbread warm enough to melt butter at first touch, the air thick with cigar smoke, and the particular laughter of men who had never known consequence. Senator Whitmore raised his glass of Kentucky bourbon, his face flushed with victory and wine. "To another 6 years of keeping this great state on the righteous path," he bellowed, and the crystals sang when the glasses met. Judge Whitmore's gold tooth caught the light as he grinned. Colonel Hayes loosened his silk cravat, already drunk on more than spirits. The senator's sons, Thomas and Benjamin, barely old enough to vote but already seasoned in cruelty, slapped each other's backs like this was just another evening of their birthright. But downstairs, in quarters where the floorboards creaked secrets and the walls sweated sorrow, a different kind of preparation was unfolding. The fire in the kitchen hearth burned low, casting dancing shadows that seemed to whisper of older hungers than those being fed upstairs. Here, the air tasted of fear and old pain, seasoned with the salt of tears shed in silence. The wooden bowls bore stains that no scrubbing could erase, not just from food, but from the blood of split lips and broken spirits. And moving through this space like a ghost made flesh, Lydia worked with the precision of a woman who understood that some recipes required more than ingredients. Her name was Lydia Crowfeather, though the auction block papers that made her property simply read, Lydia, good with herbs, docile. The white men who wrote those words had no understanding of what docility looked like when it was wrapped around a core of Cherokee iron and seasoned with 37 years of witnessing horrors that would break lesser souls. She had been born free in the mountains where her grandmother's people still remembered the time before borders, before the white man's papers decided who belonged to whom. Her Cherokee name meant, she who remembers, and by God, she remembered everything. The morning when the slave catchers came with their dogs and chains, following papers that claimed her grandmother owed debts to a white trader who had cheated her out of her land. She remembered the auction block in Charleston where she watched families torn apart like paper dolls, mothers reaching for children who would never again know their touch. But most of all, she remembered the faces of the 5 men who had purchased her. Not for field work, they said, but for her knowledge of healing herbs. They had grand plans for a house servant who could doctor their ailments and keep their other property healthy enough to work. What they discovered instead was that healing and harming were separated by nothing more than intention and dosage. Senator Whitmore had bought her for his wife's consumption, thinking Cherokee herb knowledge might cure the lung sickness that kept the senator's lady confined to her chambers. Lydia had indeed cured her, with foxglove tea and gentle doses of willow bark, but Mrs. Whitmore's gratitude had not extended to gratitude for her husband's cruelties. The senator's wife died peaceful in her sleep 3 years later, and Lydia wept genuine tears over the grave of the only white woman who had ever spoken her name with kindness. The senator's brother, Judge Whitmore, had borrowed Lydia's services when his own cook fell ill. She had watched him sentence runaway slaves to death while eating breakfast, signing execution orders between bites of the biscuit she had made with her own hands. His gold tooth was a trophy pulled from the mouth of a slave who had dared to learn reading, and he wore it like a badge of honor. Thomas and Benjamin, the senator's sons, had grown from cruel boys into crueler men under Lydia's watchful eye. Thomas the elder took particular pleasure in the whip and had once beaten a field hand to death for looking at a white woman in town. Benjamin preferred psychological torments, promising freedom to slaves who performed humiliating acts, then laughing as he revealed the promises were lies. Colonel Hayes, the senator's brother-in-law, was perhaps the worst of them all. He owned the plantation next to the Whitmore estate, and his appetites ran toward the young women in his quarters. Lydia had delivered too many babies with Hayes's pale eyes, and had watched too many of those children disappear into the slave trade when they grew old enough to resemble their father too closely for his comfort. Each of these men had taught Lydia lessons they never intended. They had shown her that evil could wear fine clothes and speak in educated tones. They had demonstrated that power corrupted not just the wielder but everyone who allowed it to continue unchallenged. And most importantly, they had proved that sometimes justice wore a different face than the law allowed. In the root cellar beneath the kitchen, Lydia kept her grandmother's legacy: mason jars filled with dried herbs, powders ground from roots, and tinctures that could heal or harm depending on the measure and the intent. Pokeweed berries, beautiful and purple as a bishop's robe, but deadly when concentrated. Jimsonweed, which brought visions that could turn into nightmares. Water hemlock, the most dangerous of all, resembling innocent parsley to untrained eyes, but carrying death in every leaf. Her plan had been growing like a cancer for months, fed by each new cruelty, each fresh horror. The election night celebration would be perfect, all 5 men together, their guard down with drink and victory, their appetites sharp for the feast she would prepare. She had tested her mixtures on rats in the cellar, perfecting the balance between swift action and prolonged suffering, because she wanted them to understand, in their final moments, exactly what they had done, and who was delivering their judgment. The afternoon of the election, Lydia moved through the mansion's kitchen like a woman possessed by righteous ghosts. She had sent the other house servants away on errands that would keep them distant and innocent. Mary to the market for ribbons the senator's daughters didn't need, Samuel to the stables to tend horses that were already perfectly groomed. Only she remained, the sole architect of the evening's true agenda. She prepared the meal with the same attention to detail that her grandmother had taught her for healing ceremonies. Every ingredient measured precisely, every step performed with ritual care. The roasted duck received its glaze of honey mixed with pokeweed concentrate, sweet enough to mask the bitter undertones, potent enough to begin the work within minutes of consumption. The cornbread, golden and inviting, was leavened with flour that had been carefully mixed with groundwater hemlock, the deadly roots she had harvested from the creek bed behind the slave quarters. The sweet potatoes presented a more delicate challenge. Senator Whitmore was particular about his vegetables, and any off-taste would raise suspicion. Lydia solved this by injecting each potato with a concentrated tincture of jimsonweed using a hollow reed, a technique her grandmother had shown her for delivering medicine to the hearts of roots. The entry points were so small they vanish. Heed when the potatoes were roasted, and the hallucinogenic poison would begin its work slowly, creating confusion and terror as the other toxins began their deadlier dance. For the wine, aged bourbon that the senator prized above gold, Lydia added drops of foxglove tincture, the same herb that had eased his wife's passing, but in doses that would stop hearts instead of slowing them. She had calculated the portions based on each man's size and drinking habits, observed over years of serving their meals and cleaning their vomit after their excesses. As she worked, Lydia found herself thinking of specific moments, specific cruelties that each man would pay for tonight. Senator Whitmore, who had sold her friend Celia's children to settle a gambling debt, would taste his own medicine in the honey that sweet-talked his way to power. Judge Whitmore, who had condemned so many to death while filling his own belly, would find his final meal becoming his executioner. Thomas, who loved the sound of the whip, would hear his heartbeat become the rhythm of his own demise. Benjamin, who broke promises like kindling, would learn that some vows, like vengeance, could not be broken. And Colonel Hayes, who had torn families apart for his pleasure, would feel his own body betray him, as he had betrayed so many others. The sun set like spilled blood across the Kentucky sky as the 5 men gathered in the dining room, their voices already loud with drink and victory. Lydia could hear them from the kitchen, the senator's booming laugh, the judge's wheeze from too many cigars, the colonel's crude jokes that made the young men snicker like schoolboys. They were celebrating not just political victory, but their continued dominion over human lives, their unquestioned right to buy and sell souls like cattle. She arranged the poisoned feast on the finest china, each plate a carefully crafted death sentence. Her hands remained steady as she carried the first course to the dining room, her face a mask of the servility they expected and had never bothered to see past. To them, she was furniture that could cook, useful, necessary, but not quite human enough to warrant real notice. "Lydia," Senator Whitmore called as she set down the cornbread, "this smells magnificent. You've outdone yourself tonight." "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice carrying none of the satisfaction building in her chest like a warm fire. "I wanted everything to be perfect for such an important evening." Judge Whitmore reached for the cornbread immediately, his greed as predictable as sunrise. "Election night deserves a feast fit for kings," he declared, tearing off a chunk large enough to choke on. If only he knew how prophetic those words would prove. The duck came next, its skin crackling and golden, the poisoned glaze gleaming like amber in the candlelight. Colonel Hayes carved with the same enthusiasm he brought to all his appetites, piling his plate high while complimenting Lydia's skill. Thomas and Benjamin fought playfully over the best pieces, their youth making them hungry for everything, including their own destruction. Back in the kitchen, Lydia poured the tainted bourbon into crystal decanters, watching the liquid catch the firelight like liquid murder. She thought of her grandmother's words. "Every plant has 2 spirits, child, the healer and the destroyer. The difference lies in the intention of the one who calls them forth." Tonight, she was calling forth destroyers, summoning the dark spirits of Cherokee justice to balance scales that had been weighted against her people for too long. She carried the bourbon to the dining room on a silver tray, her movements graceful and unhurried. Men were already deep into their meal, faces flushed with satisfaction and early intoxication. None of them noticed the slight smile that touched Lydia's lips as she poured their final drinks. The pokeweed worked first, as she had planned. Senator Whitmore was mid-sentence, describing his plans for new legislation to strengthen fugitive slave laws, when his words began to slur. Not the familiar slur of drunkenness, but something deeper, more troubling. His hand went to his throat as if trying to massage words back into clarity. Judge Whitmore noticed his brother's distress and started to rise from his chair, but his own legs betrayed him. The water hemlock in the cornbread was beginning its work, attacking his nervous system with the precision of a Cherokee hunter's arrow. His gold tooth caught the candlelight as his mouth opened in a silent question, his body already understanding what his mind refused to accept. The Jimson weed in the sweet potatoes brought its own particular horror. Colonel Hayes began seeing things in the shadows, shapes that moved when they shouldn't, faces that accused him of crimes he had thought safely buried. He clawed at his eyes, trying to banish visions of the children he had sold, the women he had violated, the families he had destroyed for his pleasure. Thomas and Benjamin, youngest and strongest, fought the poison longer, but youth could not overcome Cherokee knowledge passed down through generations of women who understood that survival sometimes required terrible choices. Thomas reached for his pistol, with hands that no longer obeyed his commands, while Benjamin tried to call for help with a voice that had become a whisper. Lydia stood in the doorway between kitchen and dining room, watching 5 demons dressed as gentlemen receive their judgment at last. She felt no joy. This was not celebration but completion, the closing of a circle that had been opened with chains and whips and the screams of innocence. "You taught me this," she said quietly, her words carrying across the room, though her voice never rose above conversational tone. "You taught me that power means taking what you want from those too weak to stop you. You taught me that promises can be broken when convenient. You taught me that some lives matter less than others." She stepped into the room, moving between the writhing bodies like a dark angel of judgment. But most of all, You taught me that justice sometimes wears a different face than the law allows." Senator Whitmore tried to speak, his lips forming words that never found sound. His eyes, wide with terror and understanding, found Lydia's face, and saw there not the docile servant he had owned, but the Cherokee woman who had been shaped by his cruelties into something harder than winter and more patient than stone. One by one, they fell silent. The foxglove stopped hearts that had never learned to beat with mercy. The water hemlock silenced voices that had spoken only orders and threats. The pokeweed brought fever dreams that showed them their victims' faces. The Jimson weed made them see truth in their final moments, that they had been not masters but monsters, not civilized men but demons wearing the masks of gentility. When the house slaves returned from their errands, they found Lydia sitting calmly in the kitchen, her hands folded in her lap like a woman at prayer. The dining room had become a tableau of justice served cold, 5 bodies arranged around a table laden with the feast that had become their judgment. Mary, the young house girl, screamed when she saw the bodies. Samuel dropped the horse blanket he had been carrying and backed toward the door, but Lydia remained seated, unmoved by the chaos beginning to unfold around her. "Miss Lydia," Samuel whispered, his voice shaking like autumn leaves. "What happened? What did you do?" "I cooked them their last meal," she replied simply, "and they ate every bite." The sheriff arrived with the sunrise, summoned by neighbors who had heard Mary's screams carrying across the frost-brittle air. He found Lydia exactly where the other servants had left her, sitting in the kitchen chair as if she had been waiting her entire life for this moment. Sheriff Morrison was a thin man with nervous hands who had won election by promising to keep the slaves in line and the white folks comfortable. He had expected to find chaos, perhaps a slave revolt that would require his full force to suppress. Instead, he found one Cherokee woman who looked at him with eyes that held no fear, no remorse, and no surprise. "Lydia," he said, his voice cracking slightly as he spoke her name. "Did you kill these men?" "I fed them," she answered, her Cherokee grandmother's dignity flowing through her words like water over stone. "They ate with their usual greed. What happened after that was between them and the spirits they had wronged." The trial was a mockery of justice, though not in the way Sheriff Morrison intended. Lydia was not permitted to speak in her own defense. Slave testimony against white victims was inadmissible, even when the slave confessed to the crime. Instead, she sat in the defendant's chair while white lawyers argued over her fate as if she were not present, as if her thoughts and motivations were irrelevant to the proceedings. The prosecutor, a florid man named Councilman Drake, who had been Senator Whitmore's campaign manager, painted Lydia as a savage who had murdered civilized men in their own home. He spoke of the senator's contributions to Kentucky, the judge's years of faithful service, the promising futures of the 2 young men who would never see another sunrise. He called for swift justice, meaning swift revenge, to demonstrate that Kentucky would not tolerate such unprecedented rebellion from its property. The defense attorney, appointed by the court and clearly uncomfortable with his role, offered only that Lydia had been driven to madness by her savage nature and the unnatural burden of her herbal knowledge. He suggested that death was too harsh for someone who was not fully responsible for her actions, being neither white nor entirely civilized. Through it all, Lydia sat with her grandmother's posture, straight-backed, eyes forward, hands folded. When the judge asked if she understood the charges against her, she nodded once. When he asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, she spoke the only words she was allowed. "They taught me everything I needed to know." The courtroom fell silent. Those 6 words carried more weight than all the legal arguments, more truth than all the testimony. In that moment, even the white observers understood that they were witnessing not just the trial of a murderer, but the judgment of a system that had created its own destroyer. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out within the week, just as swift and certain as the prosecutor had demanded. But as the bailiff led Lydia away in chains, whispers began to follow her through the courthouse corridors. Whispers that would grow into legends, spread through slave quarters like seeds on fertile ground. The hanging was set for dawn on November 20th, 12 days after election night. They built the gallows in the courthouse square, using lumber from trees that had shaded slave auctions for decades. The irony was lost on the white officials, but not on the slaves who gathered to witness Cherokee justice receive its final act. Lydia walked to the gallows with the same steady pace she had used to serve poisoned feasts. She wore a simple gray dress and her grandmother's silver bracelet, the only possession she had been allowed to keep through years of bondage. Her hair was braided in the Cherokee manner, woven with threads of red that caught the morning light like drops of blood or promises of fire. Preacher Williams, a white minister who had never preached against slavery, offered to pray for her soul. Lydia declined politely, explaining that her grandmother's spirits would guide her journey, and they had never needed white permission for their work. Sheriff Morrison read the charges and sentence in a voice that shook despite his efforts at official authority. The crowd of white observers had come expecting to see a savage receive her due, but found themselves witnessing something that felt more like ceremony than execution, as if they were the audience for rituals they could not understand. When they placed the noose around her neck, Lydia spoke her final words clearly enough for everyone to hear. "I go to join the ancestors who remember every child sold, every woman violated, every man broken by your whips. We are patient people. We remember everything, and there are more of us than you know." The trap door opened, but Lydia's words lingered in the air like smoke from sacred fires, settling into the ears of every slave present and finding root in soil made fertile by years of suffering and hope deferred. Within days, the story began to change in the telling. Slave quarters whispered that Lydia had not died but transformed, becoming a spirit who watched over those who suffered injustice. Kitchen servants spoke in hushed tones about recipes that carried more than flavor, about herbs that remembered the hands that gathered them, and the intentions that guided their use. White families throughout Kentucky began to eye their servants with new suspicion, wondering what knowledge lurked behind apparently docile faces, what patience masked itself as servility. Dining rooms that had once felt like sanctuaries of power became places where every meal carried the possibility of judgment. Every loyal servant might be a Cherokee woman's spiritual daughter, waiting for the right moment to balance scales that had been weighted against justice for too long. The senator's mansion was sold within a month, but no white family would live there. It stood empty through the winter, and by spring, slave children dared each other to peek through its windows where some claimed they could still smell the scent of Cherokee herbs mixed with the ghosts of poisoned feasts. Lydia Crow Feather's name was never written in the history books that celebrated Kentucky's great men, but it lived on in whispered songs and coded stories passed from grandmother to granddaughter in quarters where the real history of America was preserved in memory and passed down like precious seed for future planting. They say that even now, when injustice gathers at the table to feast on the suffering of others, there is a presence in the kitchen, patient hands that remember every recipe for resistance. Cherokee. Eyes that see through masks of civilization to the savagery beneath, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that some debts, however long delayed, will always come due. History remembers the powerful, but the powerless remember everything. In every kitchen where the oppressed prepare meals for their oppressors, in every quiet moment where patience builds like poison in mason jars, the spirit of Cherokee justice waits. Not for glory, not for recognition, but for the moment when balance tips and the last become first, when the meek inherit not just the earth, but the terrible knowledge of how to reclaim it. What violence lies buried beneath our sugar? Whose cries became the seasoning for our national feast? These questions linger, like the scent of herbs in abandoned kitchens, waiting for someone brave enough to taste the truth about how this nation was built and who paid the price for its prosperity. Lydia's story reminds us that resistance takes many forms, that justice sometimes wears faces the law does not recognize, and that the spirits of the wrong do not rest until balance is restored. If you enjoyed this story of buried truths and Cherokee justice, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear these histories that never made it into the official books. It really helps the channel keep bringing you the real stories of resistance, courage, and the patient power of those who remember everything. Because some recipes should never be forgotten, and some debts can only be paid in full.